Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. You still may be seeing after images of Carnival on your platform of choice, and in that premise we aim to speak about sex, gender and sexuality, the basics. Now to help us through this foundation-setting conversation, we have Bahamas-born, Trinidad-based queer writer, artist, scholar and activist Dr. Angelique V. Nixon. We also have activist and organizer, project and community outreach associate for CAISO Sex and Gender Justice, Johannah-Rae Reyes.
So, Angelique, sexuality, what is it?
Oh, Kellogg, sexuality is complicated, but let's break it down.
Okay.
A good way to look at it is through the sexuality matrix. There are 4 components of the matrix.
Right.
Identity, behavior, experiences, and desire.
Okay.
These intertwining strands all contribute to what our sexuality is, and these can change over time.
Okay.
The Venn diagrams show how these aspects of sexuality sometimes overlap, but also don't have to. We're all different and have unique experiences and desires, which can influence our identity and behaviors, especially when it comes to sexuality.
And I want to thank you so much for making the time. Let's start off with you, please, Dr. Nixon. You said that it's complicated. So let us start off by setting a premise, setting a context, placing this conversation in context. Thank you.
Yes. Well, sexuality is complicated because we all have one, right? We all have sexuality, and sexuality is layered, and it influences so many different aspects of our lives. Sexuality is also culturally contextual. Like, we are in our particular cultures, we are raised with particular ideas about sex and sexuality. And so we're putting this into context today because during the Carnival season, as we know, our bodies are on display. And there are ways that we, even though it's supposed to be a time of freedom and expression and a time where we're supposed to celebrate bodies, we also see that sex and sexuality and gender become very policed during that time. And sometimes the policing of our gender and sexuality, we see it happening in media, we see it happening in the public spaces, even during a time when Carnival is supposed to be where we're free, where we're celebrating our bodies. So it's just something that we have noticed through our work with CAISO, and where our experiences of our bodies, especially if we think about ourselves as in our bodies as queer identified people, that in particular LGBTQI plus people experience a lot of harassment and judgment during in the public, especially during heightened moments where sexuality is on display. And so we're noticing that policing during times, even of Carnival, we're supposed to be celebrating. And so we're placing this into context to talk about the ways that homophobia, sexism, and transphobia can coalesce and police our sexuality even more. And, for this session, we really want to humanize our experiences as LGBTQI plus people and members of the LGBTQI plus community, beyond laws and beyond fears. We are human, we are here, we are people, and we want to be able to enjoy public spaces. We're going to be able to enjoy ourselves and be free, just like everyone.
Thank you so much for that. And it's interesting that you have that juxtaposition about celebrating bodies, but it seems as though it's not everybody that is celebrated. And with that, I want to ask you, please, Ms. Reyes, talk to me about anxieties about sex, gender, sexuality in the population of Trinidad and Tobago from where you sit.
In Trinidad and Tobago, there are a lot of people who don't necessarily differentiate between sex, gender, and sexuality. There's also not a vast understanding of, the diversities that could exist in terms of sex. People often think of sex in terms of male and female, but they don't think about the existence of intersex people and how that could complicate the binary as they have it in their minds. Then we also talk about, gender as this specific thing when actually gender is very culture specific and varies throughout, different societies and time periods. In some cultures, men have long hair. In some cultures, men wear dresses. In some cultures, they don't. And it's, it's a different type of, dress code that happens. So the idea that gender is something that's set in stone when, in fact, it's not, and it's socially constructed. And using, people's sex, using people's gender identity to then, decide whether they can be included in the society or not, whether they can, access government service, whether they can access public services is, extremely unfair. And it's something that impacts members of the LGBTQ community in a very negative way. And NGOs like ours, CAISO Sex and Gender Justice, specifically through our Wholeness and Justice program, we have to work, do a lot of work to remind people, remind institutions that, as Angelique was saying, LGBTQ people are people. Many of us are citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have the rights that are supposed to be afforded to us as humans and as citizens.
And with that, we take a short break. We actually have a small clip of some of the other work that is taking place with CAISO Sex and Gender Justice. Stay with us. We return with more.
Hi, my name is Ian Danulal. I am deaf. I am here to tell you about CAISO Sex and Gender Justice's Wholeness and Justice program. The goal of this program is to provide legal and social services to LGBTQIA+ community members who experience human rights violations. The focus of the program is on human rights and healing. Why? Because both are equally important. Now, what is a violation? A violation is an action or inaction that impacts a person's human rights in a negative way. Example, any kind of abuse or violence from a person or authority, or any barrier to accessing a public service, or any failure to act when someone comes to you for help. That's because sexual identity does not always have to align with behavior, experience, or desire.
Yes.
Okay.
So sexual identity is how I identify and might share publicly or not.
Okay.
Sexual desires relate to who or what I'm interested in doing. Sexual behavior is what I do. And sexual experience is what I've done.
Okay. So where does the LGBTQI+ come in?
LGBTQI+ is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and intersex. It's often used as a shorthand or even an umbrella term to group sexual and gender diversity.
So under the LGBTQI+ umbrella, sexual orientation and gender identity are included?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Gender identity is how a person describes and identifies their gender, which can be aligned with or different from the sex they were assigned at birth, or even exist outside the gender binary. Cisgender is someone who aligns with sex at birth, transgender is someone who doesn't, and gender nonconforming, non-binary, and genderqueer, those are used to describe someone who identifies outside of the binary or is gender fluid. And of course, it's important to note that gender identity is different from and distinct from sexual orientation.
And with that, we welcome you back. We are speaking with Dr. Angelique V. Nixon as well as Johannah-Rae Reyes of CAISO Sex and Justice. And you started intimating on it, Ms. Reyes, in the sense that we're dealing with more than binary equations. I want you to pick up on it, please, Dr. Nixon, and because from the clip to asking you to expand on it, thank you. What should you want people, or what should we be thinking about when we say sex and gender, basic definitions and the key distinctions.
Yes. So, we really want more understanding about the fact that gender, because gender is a social construction, we sometimes have this rigid notion that it has to be masculine or feminine, or we are either male or female or man or woman. But the fact is that human beings are much more complex, and we should be celebrating that. Let's celebrate our differences. And when we conflate sex and gender, when we assume that you can only be one or the other, we actually limit our potential. We limit our potential of who we can be and how we can celebrate our expression, our different ideas of how we have emotions, our desires, and how we want to move in the world, how we want to be. And, these rigid notions then give rise to a lot of harmful gender norms that reinforce different forms of violence, from sexism and misogyny to homophobia and transphobia, and the kind of stereotypes that then limit or enforce really problematic ideas about the way that people should be, how you should behave, how you should act, what you should look like. And these are the kinds of things that give rise to violence and misunderstanding, and it causes a lot of harm. And so, when we make assumptions about people's sexual orientation that's simply based on one idea of gender or gender expression or identity, and then we limit that person, or we make assumptions that, everyone should be straight or everyone must be straight, or that's the natural way that we should be. But in fact, that's not the case. In our Caribbean, as well as around the world, and all of the cultures that we come from, and our ancestors have had diverse ways of being in gender and in sexuality. And so sexual orientation and diversity and gender identity and diversity is nothing new. Those Western binary systems are actually things that we inherited through those colonial structures and institutions, and they became the norm. That doesn't mean they have to be our norm or that they are the norm, because in fact, human sexuality and gender is much more complex. And that's what we really, in learning more deeply about gender, sex, and sexuality, we embrace more of who we are, we create more understanding of our complexity. And I think that we decrease the kinds of violence that we see in our society that come from this idea that you have to be this way, you have to act this way or look this way, or this is who you must love. We allow for more freedom, and we allow ourselves to be who we are.
And it's interesting, that makes me think of two things. One, to label is to limit. Also, sometimes you have these forms, and sometimes it feels as though it's kind of arbitrary, where people ask about sex or they ask about gender and what are some of the options that are put in. But looking at the time that we have, though, we ended the first half of the conversation with Mr. Danulal talking about the Wholeness and Justice Program. And Ms. Reyes, I want you to speak about that, thank you, in terms of the CAISO Wholeness and Justice Program, please.
Wholeness and Justice is a program established by CAISO in 2020 in order to expand access for LGBTQ people in Trinidad and Tobago to wholeness, justice, and social services. We support people who have experienced a violation which is loosely defined, and can, include a broad range of violence, human rights abuses, and it's important that if you've had an encounter that you don't feel quite right about in your spirit, or it's, extremely wrong, you can definitely call us and we can talk about it and do an assessment of, the experience that you had, and also develop a plan in terms of how you can move towards achieving wholeness, achieving justice. We do this work through the different arms of the program. We have a clinical team that assists people with psychological and mental health services. We have our legal team that consists of our community lawyer that assists people, with a wide range of legal services. And then we also have our social services, which focuses on, different aspects of the human life in terms of skills, food support, and, it's for members of the LGBTQI+ community based in Trinidad and Tobago.
We have about a minute and a half more, but the time of wholeness and justice formation is an interesting time. 2020 makes me think of the pandemic, makes me think of the fact that oversights and access would have been closed in a great deal of ways. What are some of the things that you're dealing with, and what are some of the numbers people who are accessing the services, and what type of services? Is it legal? Is it psychosocial? What are some of those numbers like, Ms. Reyes?
We've had definitely an increase in folks accessing our services to get legal support as well as food support. From the COVID pandemic, a lot of the members of our community who are engaged in the informal services weren't able to work during that time, and were in some ways excluded from the government services for various reasons. And we would have been able to offer them, support during that time. And our legal services, as well as our psychological services, have been, greatly accessed by people for a number of things. People who want to do name changes, so that even if they can't, get their gender markers to be like affirming on their documents, they could at least have their name that, represents who they are as a person and, represents them and how they want to be referred to by, institutions. And we've also had people who've experienced, institutional neglect, and they have been able to access support from us.
And for that, we are very grateful. And people ask sometimes, what's in a name? There's a great deal. And we are going to be playing something, a continuation of that clip from Wholeness and Justice. But we want to thank you, Dr. Angelique V. Nixon. We want to thank you very much, Johannah-Rae Reyes. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.
The team at Wholeness and Justice is here to listen and offer support that is specific to you. To contact Wholeness and Justice, please call 282-2476. You can call, text, or WhatsApp video or text. We are available between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. Monday to Friday, and we will respond as soon as possible. Or you can reach us via email at wholenessandjustice@caisott.org.